Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about some of the books I've been reading recently, and while I have some great, really interesting books to discuss, I do want to note that we are almost a quarter of the way through 2019, and I have yet to read a book that has really lingered with me, a book that has just been like the pinnacle, primo, stab you in the heart good, and I've been feeling kind of despondent and uninspired because of that. So if you stick around for the end of this video, I am going to include a request for recommendations of some of your favorite books that might help kind of pull me out of the depths of my very minor despair. But before we get into that, let's talk about some of the books I have been reading recently. The first two books I want to mention briefly are Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday and Outline by Rachel Cusk. I did side-by-side reviews of both of these novels a few weeks ago because they both kind of deconstruct the novel as a form in really new and interesting ways. And they both consider the function and purpose of narrative today, although they approach that question from very different angles. And both of these novels are more experimental than I tend to prefer in fiction, but they're both very much in conversation with the current state of literature and culture and the particular moment that we're in. So I do think you'll get more out of them if you consider them within their broader contexts and not just as isolated narratives. Because as isolated stories, I think they're interesting enough, but I really do think these are the kind of books that are more likely to rattle around in your head for a long time and less likely to hit you in the heart. Of these two, Asymmetry adheres to slightly more conventional storytelling, while Outline is a series of conversations and ideas that unspool in a much more loose and liquid way. And for that reason, Outline is perhaps less satisfying in the traditional sense, but I have found myself thinking about Outline more in the weeks since I read these books because its ideas about narrative have really made me think about the ways in which I narrativize my own life and the lives of people around me and how that is sometimes useful and sometimes not. But I do recommend both of these books, and I encourage you to check out my full review if you want to hear more of my thoughts. I'll link that down below. Another really interesting and kind of challenging book that I read recently was Dear Friend, From My Life, I Write to You in Your Life by Yiyun Li. And I picked this up because I wanted to read it ahead of her latest novel, Where Reasons End. And this is a series of essays and reflections that were written over a period when Yiyun Li was hospitalized for severe depression and suicidal thoughts. And this book considers the subjects of suicide and self, and beyond that, of language and writing. And Li often approaches these topics through the texts of other writers that she loves. But for a book that explores something as personal and intimate as depression and suicide, Li is quite insistent on keeping her lens of inquiry turned away from herself. And the result is this book that kind of fully immerses you in the mind of this writer without ever really giving you a full view of her as a person. You get a sense of her desire to kind of write around herself, and she talks specifically about the decision that she made to abandon her native Chinese language and write only in English. She calls English her private language, and you can feel her using it as a kind of screen, because even within English, she remains a kind of evasive figure. She says, "A word I hate to use in English is I. It is a melodramatic word. In Chinese, a language less grammatically strict, one can construct a sentence with an implied subject pronoun and skip that embarrassing I, or else replace it with we. Living is not an original business. What does this I matter to you when it means so little to myself?" She also talks about how she reads not to insert herself into another person's story, but instead to inhabit a world where she doesn't exist and where there are characters and people who don't know her and who don't care about her. She talks about wanting to have thoughts without feeling, and she berates herself for forming attachments when what she really wants is, quote, to be free from all that haunts one and to keep a distance so as never to haunt others. And so you get a sense of her as a person who seeks out isolation as a means of self-protection and self-preservation. And you get the sense that in maintaining a kind of detachment as a writer, she's putting up another sort of barrier and preventing any attachment from forming between writer and reader. There's just so much interesting and difficult stuff to dig through here, including a chapter on memory and melodrama, her thoughts on how writing in some ways is simply the search for those things which cannot be written about, and her prevailing belief in the discreteness of human experience and the sometimes unbridgeable distance between one life and another. So while this book can certainly feel detached and intellectual and almost academic at times, the ideas here are so worth considering, and Lee's approach is so unique and resolute. So I definitely recommend it if it sounds interesting to you, with the caveat that it is by no means an easy read. Next up, I have Chemistry by Weike Wang, which is a short, crisp little novel about a woman who is getting her PhD in chemistry and living with her long-term fellow scientist boyfriend when said boyfriend asks her to marry him and follow him to Ohio when they both complete their degrees. And this question kind of hangs in the air for the first half of this novel and triggers a slow but steady mental breakdown for our narrator, who ends up taking time out of school and tutoring undergrads while she tries to figure out what to do with her life, and while she fends off questions from her Chinese immigrant parents about when she's going to complete her PhD. And this book is written in a rather clipped, clean style that I would almost call clinical if it weren't for the perfect dry humor that runs throughout it like an electrical current. So there's a deadpan, absurdist tone here that at times reminded me of The Idiot, but there were also faint shades of Convenience Store Woman as well, at least in the sense that the narrator seemed a bit detached and removed from things. And you get the sense that the minimalistic style of this book is meant not only to evoke the narrator's scientific background, but also to serve as a kind of simple, pristine cover for all of the thoughts and emotions that she doesn't want to deal with. And beyond the humor of it, Wang really explores a lot of interesting ideas here, including the narrator's strained relationship with her parents, who are unhappy and demanding and closed off in different ways. There's the ever-present resentment she feels towards her boyfriend for being the kind of person who has always known what he's wanted to do, and for having affectionate parents who have never said a mean thing to him. There are discussions of language and the feeling of being caught between two languages or excluded by language. And above all, this book grapples with the more existential question of what to do with one's life, what we owe to our parents and to ourselves, and how much pure passion plays a role in all of that. So this book has a lot of great stuff going for it, and I found the reading experience to be really enjoyable. But there are also key elements here that just screamed MFA thesis to me in a way that I found really disappointing, mostly in the way that Wang seemed quite insistent on explaining her characters' motivations and decisions entirely through their backstories, which often felt quite simplistic or even cliche. And things like that just felt all too familiar and kind of muted everything that was unique and intriguing about the rest of the book. And I normally don't care too much about book endings, but the one here was really disappointing and didn't seem particularly justified to me, so that was kind of a letdown as well. Next up, I have Unmarriageable by Soniah Kamal, which is a modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice set in early aughts Pakistan in the fictional city of Dalipabad. It follows 30-year-old Alice Binat, who is a teacher at a local girls' school and one of 5 daughters that her mother is all too eager to marry off to well-heeled and respectable matches. Enter the very eligible Fahad Bingla, who quickly takes a shine to Alice's sister Jenna, and enter Bingla's worldly but standoffish best friend Valentine Darcy, and you know where the story goes from there, because of all of the Bronte or Austen retellings that I've read, this is by far the most beat-by-beat retelling of the bunch, to the point that nothing in this book is really surprising on a plot level. Instead, Instead, the real departures in this book can be found in the details, especially in Kamal's often luxurious descriptions of food and clothing, and in all the smells and sounds and energy of multi-day wedding ceremonies or of cricket matches. The leads of this novel are also understandably more modern and progressive than their predecessors, Alice being an independent, feminist-minded woman, and Darcy, for his part, is quite woke for a male lead, supportive of the women in his life, and interested in Alice not only for her fine eyes, but also as an intellectual equal, someone he can engage with about everything from his favorite books to the lingering impact of colonialism and British rule in post-partition Pakistan. And all of that adds a richness and a real sense of discovery to this book that makes it feel genuinely new, which is why Kamal's insistence on hewing so closely to the original plot of Pride and Prejudice is so disappointing, because it really takes the wind out of this book's sails and prevents it from charting its own course. Especially in the back half of this book, things start to feel all too familiar and almost boring just because you know exactly where the story's gonna go. And it also doesn't help that next to Austen's kind of famously sharp wit and social satire, Kamal's commentary often feels much more heavy-handed. And on top of all of that, this book wasn't nearly as romantic as I would have hoped. While I found the relationship between Alice and Darcy endearing and sweet at times, I wouldn't call it dizzying or swoon-worthy by any stretch. So yeah, not as good as I would have hoped, but maybe worth checking out if you're interested in the premise. And lastly, I finally finished reading These Truths by historian Jill Lepore, and this is her new history of the United States of America, clocking in at 955 pages, or if you go the audiobook route, 29 hours of listening. And while no single volume can ever provide a truly comprehensive history of the United States, what Lepore has created here is a book that captures the scope and the breadth of American history. So much of US history, at least in my experience, is taught in chapters and chunks. And what Lepore does here is give you a picture of American history as this continuous, interconnected river where everything about where we are today has flowed down from what came before. It allows you to view events in their full context and start to recognize precursors and patterns and draw connections between events that you maybe didn't realize were there. And she writes with an energy and momentum that carries you through the book, and she selects the details that don't bog down the reading experience, but instead add a sharpness and a real human color to the text. There's a line in the book when she notes that George Washington's famous dentures contain teeth pulled from the mouths of his slaves. And later there's a passage from one of Thomas Jefferson's journals wherein that founding father, through a series of kind of agonized calculations, is trying to work out at which point the descendants of his children with Sally Hemings will be considered white. And in that vein, These Truths really works to reincorporate marginal groups, particularly women and African Americans, back into the fabric of a standard understanding of American history. And toward the beginning of the book, she notes that from the moment the first slave ships landed in Jamestown in 1619, the story of America has been one of liberty and bondage, that those are really the two fundamental truths of America. And so she considers America in all of its promises and ideals, and in the ways in which America as a democratic experiment really is quite exceptional. But she also looks at America in all of its hypocrisy and its crimes and its failures to live up to its promise. It's fascinating and essential stuff, and the 20th century history is particularly illuminating when she starts to get into things like the invention of public relations and political consulting and public opinion polling, all of which kind of fundamentally change the way that our politics work. So yeah, I really recommend this book. It's so interesting, and I've been thinking about it so much since I finished it, so it's really worth the time investment. Those are all the books I've been reading lately. Like I mentioned at the top of the video, I've been feeling generally kind of uninspired by the books I've read so far in 2019, which I think is partly why my videos have been so sporadic as of late. I was looking back, and at this point last year, I had already read a true novel, Pachinko, Half a Lifelong Romance, Love in a Fallen City, City and The White Book, which were all fantastic and most of which ended up on my best books of the year list. And I can't say that anything I've read so far this year really stacks up to any of that. So I think I'm really just in need of a super immersive and compelling book that will help get me back into the swing of things. I don't know, but if you have recommendations for any really immersive books, or if you have suggestions for books that touch on specific topics or historical periods, I am open to any and all recommendations, because I do think I really am settling into a booktube groove where I'm really only interested in making videos if it's a wrap-up or a review or a kind of themed reading video, all of which require me to read books that are interesting enough to talk about at length. So I really would be grateful for any and all recommendations that you might have. I did just start reading the Overstory, which I'm feeling optimistic about, but I will let you know how that goes. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!